Hello there. Welcome. So what do you think about when I say the word design? What comes to mind? Maybe your dream car? That one's mine. Or the phone in your pocket. Perhaps a poster for a band that's coming to town. What about this? It's just a door. A lot of people don't think about doors as design objects. But as a designer, I spend a considerable amount of time thinking about and considering the design and implementation of doors. The reason for that is this guy. His name is Don Norman. Don is an industrial designer, and he was on vacation in Europe. While he was there, he noticed that he was having trouble interacting with everyday objects, things like showers and faucets and doors. So when he came back from vacation, he wrote a book. It's called The Design of Everyday Things. And in this book, he spends a considerable amount of time talking about the design of doors. And he talks about how certain doors have what's called discoverability. Discoverability is the ability to tell how an object is meant to be used just by looking at it. So with this door, we can tell, because it has a horizontal bar and because it has those hinges up in the corners, that this door is meant to be pushed when we get to it. But not all doors have that discoverability. So over time, these doors that don't have that basic discoverability have become known as Norman doors. A Norman door is any door where the design tells you to do the opposite of what you're actually supposed to do, or a door that gives the wrong signal and needs a sign to correct it. Now these doors are everywhere. You'll start to notice them now that I pointed it out to you. They look like this. Two doors with the exact same design, the exact same handle, but they're meant to be operated completely opposite. Without the sign, as a user, how would you have any idea how to operate this door? You wouldn't. So we actually have a few of these doors at GPS INSIGHT, and just as an experiment, since I knew I was giving this presentation, I found one of these doors leading to a conference room in our office. And I scheduled the meeting in this room, and I set up a few GoPro cameras, and I invited a bunch of my colleagues to come join me in this room, just to see what would happen when they tried to interact with this door that had no visual indications on how it was meant to be used. Let's take a look.
Not good. I thought I was going to take down all the glass.
I normally look to check to see the hinges. I check to see it for a door stop, to see which way it'll swing. This one had none of those indications.
Put a sign, although, I mean, sometimes it says push and you still pull, so.
I love Carrie's response there at the end. She's absolutely right. Sometimes even if it has the sign, you still do it wrong. So why is that? How does this happen? Well, these objects are everywhere. It's not just doors. It's all sorts of things that we interact with every day. Sometimes we can tell that a door or a design is failing by watching someone use it. But other times we need to gather a little bit more information than just watching people. We need to gather huge amounts of information. And we can do that with our digital products, things like our software, by looking at all the analytical data and seeing how our products are used. I'll give you an example of how this was done recently. This is the Facebook like button. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. This button is seen about 22 billion times a day. It could be argued that this is one of the most recognizable designs in human history. But at some point, Facebook, while looking at this button, said, you know what, we need to redesign this button. Something about this button wasn't quite working. They didn't tell us why they redesigned it, but we can gather some information and try to figure that out. So Facebook is a huge company. They're worldwide. They have about 2 billion users. And in a lot of parts of the world, they're accessing the internet and Facebook on a device that looks like this. So when you're looking at that old Facebook like button, some of the things that we can gather are maybe it didn't have enough contrast when it's on a white background. Or maybe people didn't really know that it was part of Facebook because it doesn't have their logo or anything on it. So at some point, Facebook said, we need to redesign this button, so they did. This is what the new button looks like. And after this project was finished, someone asked the lead designer on the project how long it took them to redesign this button. And he came back to them sometime later and said he estimated it took about 280 hours of work. Now, just to give you reference, that's one person working 40-hour work weeks for 6 months straight on a single button. So why did they do this? Why did they take the time to redesign this button? Well, it's interesting because a lot of our everyday experience and some of the things that we do on an everyday basis are handled by our subconscious. 95% of our daily activity is handled by our subconscious brain. So I'm giving this presentation right now that I've rehearsed a bunch of times. I'm walking across the stage, but a lot of this is handled by my subconscious. I don't really have to think about it because I practice it so much. And when we interact with objects, most of the time, we don't really have to think about it because we've sort of been trained how objects are meant to be used. But sometimes we still have to use our consciousness to interact with things that don't have that basic discoverability. Things like Norman doors. When we walk up to a door and we're not quite sure how it works, our consciousness has to take over to figure it out. That would be considered a failed design. So I'll give you an example of another one. This is Henry Dreyfuss. He was an industrial designer, and in the 1930s, Bell Labs, who later became AT&T, came to him and said, we need a design for a telephone. Back in the 1930s, when you signed up for phone service, you didn't go down to Best Buy and buy a phone. The phone company actually came and installed one at your house for you to use. And so Bell Labs came to Henry Dreyfuss and said, we need you to design a phone. It's got to be a rotary phone that people can use in their houses. It's got to be really easy to use. So he went to work, and this is what he came up with. It's the Model 302. It's a beautiful looking phone. The scalloped edges on the side, the perfectly balanced headset. It's just a really good example of industrial design. In fact, we still use this silhouette when we're making icons today sometimes. But at some point, this phone, as it was being used, people started noticing some issues with it. When you put your fingers in the finger holes, some of the oil would start to rub off on the numbers and letters that were inside the finger holes. And you can't really tell from this picture, but the back of the handset is triangular shaped. In other words, it comes to a point. And when you're grabbing it with your hand, that's no big problem. But when you put it on your shoulder and try to rest it to use your head as you're talking on the phone, it would either flip over or it would just start digging in your shoulder. It wasn't very comfortable. So Bell Labs came to Henry Dreyfuss and said, we love this phone, we love the design, but we need you to redesign it. Here's some of the problems that people are having when they use this phone. So he went back to the drawing board, and a few years later, they released this. It's the Model 500. As you can see, the numbers and letters were painted outside the finger holes, and the back of the handset is flattened so that you can more easily rest it on your shoulder. Interesting side note, you can't really see it very well from this picture, but after they released this phone, people were having a hard time figuring out where to put their fingers in the hole, and so they put little aiming dots inside the holes so you knew where to aim your finger. Kind of cool. But this gave Henry an idea. He started looking at this and how this phone sort of evolved, and he said, well, if we design things from the perspective of the users who are using them, we can make much better products. So he wrote a book. In 1955, the book called Designing for People came out, written by Henry. And he took a lot of the teachings of Leonardo da Vinci, talking about how man should be the main unit of measurement for our world. And he took those same principles and he expounded on them. And he did a lot of testing and measuring what the average human dimensions were. In other words, the length of our arms or our legs, or the distance from our ear to our mouth, the things that we can see at our eye level. All those sorts of things went into consideration when designing products. And as you do that, you can create products that are much easier for humans to use. So I'll give you an example how we're taking those principles and utilizing them here at GPS Insight. This is the DVR report. I'm sure some of you have used this. It's a driving violations report. That's what DVR stands for. And originally it was just a table full of columns and rows and data that talked about how your fleet was, having violations while they were driving. And it was a great report. People found it very useful. There was a lot that could be learned from this and understanding your fleet and how they were driving. But at some point, one of our sales guys came to us and said, what if we made it so that you could see a lot more of this data a little bit more visually? What if we could summarize what's happening in this report so I don't have to sift through it and try to figure out what's going on? So we added a few graphs to the top that just summarized the data that already existed in the table. And people loved it. All of a sudden, you could pull up this report and see visually what was happening with your fleet. It made it a lot easier to identify problems or see the violations that were happening on a daily basis. And then we took that one step further and we said, well, what else could we visualize? What are other data points that we could take and do the same treatment to? So we created a metrics report that takes a lot of different kinds of data, things like fleet utilization, scorecards, that kind of stuff, and we make it more visual so that people can pull up this report and understand what's going at a glance with their fleet. And now we're taking those same principles and we're applying them to the next level. We're saying, well, how can we do this if we were to redesign our user interface? How could we incorporate these visual elements to make them a lot easier for our customers to use? I'll give you one next example. This is Sam Farber. Sam was an industrial designer, and in the late 80s, he was on vacation in southern France with his wife, Betsy. And one day, Betsy decided that she wanted to make an apple tart. She wanted to make a little snack for them to enjoy together. So she pulled out the apples, and she pulled out the peeler, and she started peeling these apples to create this apple tart. And Sam was just kind of sitting there watching her, enjoying the sunset coming in through the windows. And he noticed that she was really struggling to peel these apples. Now, one thing you have to know about Betsy is that she had mild arthritis. And she was probably using a tool that looked something like this. Now, these kind of tools, I'm sure most of you have used something like this, but they're a little bit hard to hold. They kind of dig into your hands a little bit. It's not very solid of an object, and it's just not very easy to use. And Betsy was having a real hard time peeling the apples with this tool. And so as Sam was observing her, he said, you know what? I think I could improve this design. What if we just gave it a bigger handle? So he created a prototype, and he gave it to his wife, Betsy, and he had her use it. And as she was using it, he was able to get feedback. This is called the iterative design process. It goes like this. First step is you observe somebody using a product. Then you create ideas on how you could improve that product. Then you prototype those ideas and test them with users. And as you're testing them, you can go back to the observation stage. And it's circular. It just continues to happen. And as we go through that iterative design process, we can improve our products significantly. So that's what Sam did. He ended up coming up with 15 different kitchen utensils. And in 1990, he took those 15 kitchen utensils to the Gourmet Product Show in San Francisco. Now, just to give you a little bit of reference, in 1990, this vegetable peeler on the right cost about $2. Sam was introducing his new product, the one on the left, for about $6. Now, his is obviously more improved. It's got a bigger handle. It has these little scalloped edges. It's got a little hole in the bottom that you can hang it up with. It even has a little corer on the tip. But he was a little bit nervous about whether or not this was going to be received. It was wildly successful. All of his tools, because they were made from a human's perspective and were made with empathy, trying to understand how they were meant to be used, were wildly successful. He named his company OXO, and in 2004, that company sold for $273 million. This company had been based on the principle that if you design a product from the perspective of the user, the person who's actually going to be using this object, you can then create things with empathy using the iterative design process and create much better products, which is what he did. That company still exists today. We're taking those same principles of human-centered design, iterative design, and empathy, and trying to apply those to our products. We're trying to create things that are easier and better for our customers to use. We're trying to understand our customers on a different level so that we can see what things you need in your everyday process. And as we come to understand our users better, we can create products and solutions that are much more catered to what it is that you're trying to do. We're doing that now, and we plan on continuing to do that as we redesign our interfaces and our products to make them better for you. We hope that you'll stick around and see what that looks like. We want you to participate in that process. This is why we send out those surveys, because we need your feedback to understand what it is that you're trying to accomplish as a company. What do you need to know about your fleet? As we gain that feedback and that understanding of our users, we can create much better products that are based upon you as the user. Thank you very much.